It's certainly a balancing act that you have to wear many hats or you have to put on many masks. So I find myself having to be very careful about my posture. You know, I'm 6'2", 250 a workout, so my presence could be somewhat intimidating. I'm a darker skinned, black male, bald headed, so oftentimes there's the intimidation factor I have to always consider when I enter different spaces. I'm mindful when I'm sitting down. If I'm mindful how I raise my voice. There are a host of different things we have to pay close attention to only to participate, or at least be able to position yourself so your voice can be heard, but more importantly, so your ideas and ideologies could be considered as it relates to the input you can bring to these various tables that claim they want the input, but oftentimes it's more tokenism and symbolism than it is real active engagement and participation. When I was younger, I want to say I was in high school, when there were a group of individuals who had the audacity to say I was lazy because of the stereotypical stuff that you hear. You know, obviously I had a background growing up in the projects in Rochester. I played sports, so I was written off as someone who wasn't going to consider college. So I found offense to the statement that was made that I was lazy, that I wasn't going to do anything as it pertained to going to college, would lead to me making a decision to go to college. But in the conversation I was having with a few of my classmates, when I was explaining to them how I was written off by the school administration, one of the classmates unknowingly said, "Well, not too many black people go to college, I don't believe. I'm pretty sure there's other things in which you could do." So me trying to probe as it relates to what more was being, you know, what she was thinking when she was making that statement, it led into a heated dialogue, an argument, so to speak. And as opposed to the school responding to the matter and trying to figure out what all the details and the facts were, because she had started crying because of the verbal exchange that we had, immediately I went to the office and was threatened with suspension. Without no context, she was a white female. We had a conversation that led to her crying, and immediately I was viewed as the perpetrator, as the person who was responsible for victimizing this person who made the racial comment I was trying to probe, and by me educating them, they felt guilty and started crying. And then the school staff, as opposed to them understanding all those details or the facts or the context for what happened, they immediately went, you know, to the conclusion that I did something wrong. It was actually trying to figure out ways that they could suspend me until there was a resource officer who kind of overheard the conversation, explained what happened. There was an English teacher, Mr. Lorette, who made it his priority to talk about black colleges and black students going or aspiring to go to college. Because there were many people who subscribed to the fact that, you know, the lucky black people go to college, or we don't have aspirations for higher education. And that underlying belief, or at least the statement she made, there was much more to it. And she wasn't the only person that subscribed to it, because like I said, there was other administrators as part of that so-called magnet program that said I was lazy. And that was the reason why I went to my peers with the conversation, because they actually wrote me off as well. So they wrote me off, she wrote me off, and obviously I felt, you know, there's a part of me that was outraged, but there was a part of me that was fueled to overcome, you know, those stereotypes and be able to, you know, show them different. It's painful, and it's unfortunate. Those of us, you know, who have to experience it occasionally, you develop not an insensitivity, but you start to become callous, you know, thinking about it, because you can easily become overwhelmed. When I think about the microaggressions, be it, you know, within different workplaces, when I think about the conversations I've had, I think about even myself, so-called representing individuals who come from a similar type plight and are able to voice the concerns from my lived experience, you know, even that not being regarded or strongly considered when I'm trying to speak to the issues that many people claim that they would like to mitigate and work to address. Oftentimes I have to really assert myself, even though I'm a respected or regarded leader, quote unquote. But I find myself sometimes voiceless, and then I can only imagine those individuals who may not have the so-called prestige, the educational credentials, the work experience, how they're, not being heard. And more importantly, it's not only painful, but it makes a person just really angry, and then once you become angry, you have to be very careful about the labeling. Because if a person doesn't want to take responsibility or understand the contextual factors that contribute to your anger, they start to say you don't know how to regulate your emotions. And if you start speaking too articulate about the issues in and of themselves, and you can be as objective as possible, you can be as empirical as possible, if you raise things continuously, you'll start to get blacklisted. You come around and you hear the little comments, so well, we know this is going to turn into a racial conversation, or we know this person's going to complain about the inequities. Why people just can't overlook it and move forward, as if we haven't been doing that forever. But the reality is that those things, they're not only painful, but sometimes I walk around what I like to call is this cold anger. There's the hot anger and the cold anger. The hot anger typically, dissipates with time. It's very emotional. It leads to outbursts. It leads to a person being hot-headed. So when people talk about being hot, that's typically that hot anger. That cold anger, which is an anger that lingers. It doesn't dissipate. It's calculated. It's methodical. It's precise. It's very laser-like as it relates to its focus. I found myself on both sides of the equation, but I spend most of my time with that cold anger. It doesn't go anywhere. You're very conscious of what you're doing. You're being very calculated, because you understand if you do anything that bleeds into that hot anger, the ramifications and the consequences thereof could lead to further trouble on your part. So, I find myself angry, but not hot-headed, and that's the difference. And that cold anger is what I use as motivation to fight for social justice and racial equity and socioeconomic opportunities. And I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon until I start to see the real structural systemic changes that will lead to those positive outcomes. Equity primarily means access to opportunity, equal opportunity. Equity means, to me, one of two things. Like, equity means almost like real equity that you build in the house. Like, how many people can actually build equity? How many people could actually have equitable access to opportunities for wealth creation? How many people have access to insurance? How many people can actually get bonded and start a business? So equity to me means there aren't limitations and restrictions that would prevent a person from being able to participate in society. And if there are limitations to disadvantage, that those things will be either compensated for or we take it into consideration so that person can be able to participate if they need some additional support to overcome those factors or those critical factors that they are not personally responsible for. So equity to me means participation. And not just participation to say, I'm at the table and I'm at the table with all the important people, or I'm at the table where decisions are being made. No, I'm at the table as an important person making decisions. That's what equity means to me. I think there are a number of things. I think we're starting to lift the conversation as it relates to racial equity now, as a person shared with me, and they didn't realize the language. They said there's more tolerance now that I had a conversation. And I'm thinking, I just had to chuckle, because I'm thinking to myself, we're lucky, because I think we were on the verge of another rebellion. If we weren't not having these conversations, I think Rochester was starting to bubble up. I always said we were just one or two incidents from a Ferguson, but it seems like we're making progress in that particular regard, because we are having a conversation. Now, as it relates to looking at funding opportunities, looking at economic development opportunities, I think we need to start looking at the data and being able to allow the data to inform the practice. So we know the issues exist. We know what the data is telling us. So the question becomes, how do we engage more people of color, look outside of the natural networks? How do we create space at the table where it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game? Everyone could eat, everyone could participate and be able to contribute to one another's success. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, or, in order for me to have, you must not have. And I think once we change that ideology and we're able to encourage more participation as it relates to the economic development opportunities. The social space is starting to really integrate when you look at health, education, and human services and the work they're looking to do to make access and just, service delivery more equitable for people who are experiencing poverty and people of color. I think we have to look at every single sector, every single domain, and ask ourselves the critical questions: what can we do to strengthen equity within these particular institutions? Because if we don't do it, that's a liability as it relates to the bottom line, as it relates to, companies now that are very innovative and looking for those diverse ideas. I think it was Einstein who said it, that the same thinking used to create the problem can't be the same thinking used to resolve it. So now, we're confronted with an opportunity here. Not necessarily a problem, we're confronted with an opportunity, and if Rochester is going to see any real sustainable progress, we really have to start looking at participation very differently. So I think that's where we go from here. There's the tokenism that exists in our community, and people are dressing up rooms with what may appear to be colorful faces. But more so than just dressing up a room, the question becomes, how are we taking into consideration input that may differ from the historical practice that we have been exposed to? So when you look at a lot of the institutional leaders who may represent dominant society, there has to be an openness and a teachability index that will allow them to be receptive to new and different things. And there has to be a willingness on their part to just open themselves up to this new learning. For the individuals who are moving up the ranks, I think we have a responsibility, a social responsibility, in my opinion, a moral responsibility to be able to lift these concerns and these problems. And I'm so thankful for the City of Rochester and the partners with the Real Initiative, primarily because we're talking about things that require courage. Oftentimes, we are afraid to make reference to these inequalities and inequities because we are fearful of, somebody pulling back funding, somebody, making a statement and that will loss for us to, cause people to lose their jobs. I think there's starting to be a little bit more courage on behalf of the community, and I just will strongly encourage those active participants to continue down that particular path. It's a heavy lift, It's going to be imperative for us to actually figure out ways that we can measure progress, but we also have to be kind to ourselves and recognize and understand that the real work is not going to happen overnight. It's taken a long time to get to this particular place, and it's going to take a long time in order for us to resolve it. The issue that we have is we have to be persistent and disciplined, because if we don't see the change overnight, that doesn't mean that we're not making progress. We just have to be careful of what we identify as progress as we're going down this particular path.